Morning. Morning.
We're in Daf Tzaddik Gimel Amid Base, or actually the last three words of Tzaddik Gimel Amid Aleph, 93a. Amar Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda said, we go to 93b. What would be the halacha? We know that in order for a property to count as a Rishus HaYachad, a private domain, it has to be that it has an enclosure, a fence, a wall around it. What would be the halacha if this wall is not a wall that's 10 tefachim high, but rather it's a 5 tefachim high on the inside of the property, and on the outside of the property there is also a drop of 5 tefachim combining to 10 tefachim. So from the outside we see 10 tefachim, 5 elevation from the, let's say, street to the property, and then 5 is the fence from the property on the inside of the property. What would be the halacha in such a scenario? So the Gemara says Gidul Chamisha Umechitza Chamisha. If there's the floor is raised 5, and then there's on top of that a Gidul Chamisha, a elevation of 5, Ein Mitztarfin. They would not combine for a valid halachic wall. That's Rav Chisda's opinion. We're going to see another opinion in the Gemara shortly. He requires, Rav Chisda requires, that you have either everything in a gidud, everything elevated, or all of it is a proper wall. So basically, we're going to ask a question. We saw the halacha, if you have 2 neighboring courtyards, and each one of the courtyards themselves it makes an error for it could make an error for itself, but they're not level to each other, the neighboring courtyards, but one is elevated from the other. The upper one is a full 10 tefachim above the lower the lower space. Or it's only elevated 5. However, besides for the 5 elevation, it also has a mechitza. It also has a boundary that's above that, meaning not a boundary, a fence at the boundary that's above the 5 tefachim elevation. There's another 5 tefachim of fence. Ma'arvin shnayim. So that's a valid. That's going to count as a valid boundary between them and separation, enough that they can only make an eruv themselves, ve'emarvin echad, and they cannot make an eruv together. So we see that this concept is true, that they can make an eruv together, but not an eruv. Separate, but not an eruv together. So you see that it is a valid wall between the 2. So how can you, Rav Chisda, say that if there is an elevation of 5 and a fence of 5, they don't combine and it doesn't count as a valid eruv? That doesn't seem to be true, because we see that when neighbors, you have neighboring courtyards, it's gonna count. So the Gemara. Pachas Mekan, if you have the fence less than these 10 combined 10 tefachim, then it doesn't count as a barrier and a separation between the 2, and you actually can only make you can only carry in there if you make a joint error, because they're really one specific space, the one combined space. Amar Rava. So Rava said, Rav Chisda admits that in the lower the lower property is the one that must be alone, since it faces a full 10 tefachim wall, even though that wall is a combination of between it's a combination between the elevation of the neighboring property in addition to a fence above it. But from its perspective, from the lower property's perspective, it actually has a full a full 10 tefachim wall. So for the lower property, you can only have an eruv alone. Because it's facing a wall of 10. But the upper property, that property itself actually does not have the 10 tefachim on each side, because it can't see the drop because it has a wall, and the wall that it sees is only 5 tefachim high. So from its perspective, it doesn't have a proper wall. So then the lower property can only make an eruv on its own, but the upper can't even make an eruv on its own. It can't make an eruv on its own because it's open to a neighboring property, and it can't make a joint eruv because from the perspective of the neighboring property, it's alone. So if you're telling me that according to Rav Chisda, an elevation and then a fence, 5 and 5, combining to the 10 don't combine. So from the perspective of the lower property, they have to keep themselves separate and can make their own eruv. But from the perspective of the upper property, they only have a fence of 5 tefachim. And the lower property, and the drop, the lower half of that 10 tefachim, they don't see. They're not a part of that. So they can't make an eruv on their own, but because from their perspective, they're completely open to the neighboring property, which there's only a 5 tefach barrier between them. That's not significant. And they can't join in the eruv with the neighbor because from the neighbor's perspective, they are separated by a 10 tefachim wall. And therefore, they shouldn't be allowed to make an eruv on their own either. And yet, this Bryce had said that they're allowed to make an eruv by themselves or separate, depending whichever way they want. In this case, it says that they cannot make a joint eruv. They can make an eruv each one separately. Well, they can make an eruv each one separately. That means even the upper property can make an eruv on its own, and that's not true because from their perspective, they're completely open to another property. Amar Rabba bar Ula kagon shoyes al yona megufefes ad eser amos. So actually, what's going on is that there is a full 10 tefachim wall, even from the perspective of the upper property. However, it doesn't go the full length of the boundary. For ad eser amas, there's up to 10 tefachim, 10 amma, which is open. So it now has an opening to the neighboring property, but that opening is only visible to itself because from the perspective of the lower property, it has a full 10 tefachim wall. Well, if that's true, then let's look at the end of the halacha. If it's less than the 5 tefachim elevation plus 5 tefachim wall, then they can only make a joint eruv and cannot be separate. Well, if you're telling me that there's also an additional fence above this fence in order to make it to 10 tefachim high, even from the perspective of the upper property, how can they make a joint eruv? But why can they only be joined together? They actually have a separation with a doorway and with an opening. And then it should be up to them to decide whether they want to be together or not. Why do you say they have to be together? Which indicates that there is not a full wall above this elevation plus the 5 fence. It is talking about that the upper wall, the lower property is completely open to the upper property, and there is not even a 10 tefachim wall. Well, then we're back to our first question, that the lower property should have to make its own eruv, and the upper property cannot make an eruv at all. The lower property, from its perspective, can make an eruv only on its own because it has the barrier, but the upper can make a choice. The Gemara says, and this is what that it said, that from the if it's less than 5 tefachim barrier plus above the 5 tefachim elevation, it is indeed open completely from the upper perspective. And when it said that they can join an eruv and they can only join together and cannot make a separate eruv, that's going only on the lower property. The lower property can make it alone because they don't have any barrier between themselves and the upper, because it is a breach. But from the upper perspective, they have on part of it enough of a wall. So this is all to explain, according to Rav Chisda, who says that Gidud Chamisha, Mechitza Chamisha, that if you have a elevation of the property, in addition you have a fence, that they would count as a barrier. That does not count as a barrier. You need either completely an elevation or completely a fence. And the value of an elevation itself is because from the upper perspective, you can see that drop. But if you have partially a wall, you only see from the perspective of the upper property, all you see is that 5 tefachim elevation. That does not count. And the Gemara goes through trying to explain this. According to that, what's the scenario where the two properties, one higher than the other, would either be allowed to only make individual eruvin, but they can make an eruv by themselves, or that they have to make an eruv together, and this would be either for the upper one that it can make an eruv by itself because it has an upper wall on top of that. But it also has an opening up to 10 tefachim, or the lower wall where or the lower group can only make an eruv together because there's actually a breach in that wall, and it is from its perspective is completely open. However, the Gemara is going to say that that's not the halach. Dorash Meremar Gidud Chamisha Mechitza Chamisha Mitztarfin. Meremar, when he said a drash, when he spoke in the academy, he said the halacha is that they do count jointly and do become a valid 10 tefachim wall if you have a 5 tefach elevation plus a 5 tefach fence. Ashkache Ravina Ravacha Berei Rava. Ravina met Ravacha Berei Rava. Amalei Tani Mar Midim Mechitza. Did your teacher teach anything about this matter of a boundary which is made up half of elevation and half of wall? Amalei, no, he didn't say so. He didn't speak about it. Nevertheless, Behilchasa, the Gemara says that the halacha is Gidud Chamisha Mechitza Chamisha Mitztarfin. They do combine, and we don't have to explain the two boundaries the way Rav Chisda did, because the two properties, one elevated to the other, because it does count as a valid wall since it has 10 tefachim elevation plus the fence. The next halacha and the next Gemara is going to go into the concept of if something was a permissible space at the onset of Shabbos, does it remain permissible to carry for the remainder of Shabbos? We'll see later. It's Machlekes Rav and Shmuel. The Gemara here is going to introduce this idea. Baya Rabbi Shaya. Rabbi Shaya asked a question: do you remember Bayim Shabbos, where inhabitants join on Shabbos, meaning that the fence between two courtyards collapses, and now all of a sudden this courtyard, which was a smaller, now becomes a joint courtyard with the neighbor because there's no fence between them, and now there are new inhabitants in the courtyard that didn't join the Eruv. Do we say, oh, there's new inhabitants here and that didn't join the Eruv, you can't carry in the courtyard? Or do we say, no, you can carry through the courtyard because at the onset of Shabbos you were allowed to, so you're still allowed to? Amar Rav Chistos or Rav Chanina, Tashema. Come and hear this halacha, which will explain it to us. Chatzar gedola shenifritza lekatana. A larger courtyard, which it has a breach in its fence to the smaller courtyard, which was the halacha that we talked about in the Mishnah. And the Gemara at this point thinks that this is nifritza, that it got a breach on Shabbos. And the halacha is that the gedola materis and the larger one you're allowed to carry because there is a wall that remains in the wider part between, that's in the courtyard, that's since it's wider than the smaller courtyard, it has essentially a fourth wall with an opening to the smaller courtyard up to 10 amas. Vakatana asura, but the smaller courtyard is going to be prohibited to carry within because it only has 3 walls, because the fourth wall is completely open to the larger courtyard. That's the way the Mishnah read. Now, if you understand this to happen on Shabbos, you see that changes can happen on Shabbos. Now, the meaning over there is that breach happened before Shabbos, and that's a scenario. Don't say we can explain it that way, but that's the way you must read the Mishnah. It must be that way, that the breach happened before Shabbos. Because you've told us, the question was asked of Rav Huna and of Rav Yehuda, Eruv derech HaPesach v'nistam HaPesach. If somebody made an Eruv with a neighbor, so they have 2 courtyards, multiple homes in courtyard A, multiple homes in courtyard B, and they have a doorway between the 2 courtyards, and so they make a joint Eruv. And then something happens, and the Eruv and the door is sealed shut on Shabbos. Part of the wall collapses, and now you can't open the wall. Something fell on the other side, whatever it may be, and you now cannot open the doorway or the door that joined the 2 Eruvs. So you made an Eruv. We've seen that if there's a proper fence, a wall, that's 10 tefachim high between the 2 courtyards, they cannot make a joint Eruv. But over here, there was a doorway or a window. And so they were able to make a Eruv together. But in the midst of Shabbos, that doorway went away. It became sealed in a manner that you can no longer pass through there. And therefore, it doesn't count as a connector between the 2 courtyards. What happens? If the window becomes sealed, Amar li, and he said to me, Shabbos kivut. Shabbos, since at the onset of Shabbos, this space was permissible to carry on account of the connection between one courtyard and the other, that remains the halacha for the remainder of Shabbos. And you can pass from one courtyard to the other through whatever holes or crevices remain in the wall, wherever there used to be a window or a door, and you can continue connecting. Itmar. We learned that if there's a wall between the 2 courtyards and they collapsed, and the wall collapsed, but because it was a wall, each courtyard made its own Eruv, or they didn't make an Eruv at all, but they were not a joint space, right? So one made an Eruv by itself, or both made an Eruv by itself, but they didn't make a joint Eruv. So Rav says you can only carry within your courtyard 4 amos, but not more. Because Rav is of the opinion that this idea that we said before, that since the onset of Shabbos it was permissible to carry, remains permissible, is not true. Rav does not follow this. And right now, since the wall collapsed between the 2 courtyards, they're actually considered one courtyard that didn't make an Eruv. And now the vessels that were in the courtyard at the onset of Shabbos, you're allowed to carry. As we saw earlier, that everybody agrees that the courtyard vessels you're allowed to carry. And so you can carry through the whole thing. However, the vessels that came out of the house, you're not allowed to. And so over here, since you had an Eruv at the onset and you can bring vessels out from the house to your courtyard, So now the courtyard has vessels from the house as well. And so you can't carry into the rest of the courtyard, so you can only carry 4 amos. Shmuel Amar, and Shmuel says, and now we go to 94a, Tzadi Dalet Amar Aleph, Zeh metaltel ad ikar mechitza, v'zeh metaltel ad ikar mechitza. And Shmuel says, no, since at the onset of Shabbos, each courtyard was allowed to carry up until where the wall was, to the fence between the 2 courtyards, even though the fence collapsed, each courtyard can continue to do what it was doing before, and it remains permissible to carry within its courtyard up to where the fence was. And the teaching of Rav, that he says that you're not allowed to carry, wasn't explicit, but it happened from a story. The Rav and Shmuel Rav and Shmuel, the 2 leaders of the yeshivas, the academies in Bavel, one in Surah, one in Naharda, and they were sitting together one Shabbos in a courtyard. Nafal Guda the Beni, and the fence, the barrier that was between the 2 courtyards collapsed. Amalo Shmuel, so Shmuel said, we need privacy. Shekulu Galima, take a garment, Negiduba, and put it up there and spread it over where the wall was, so we still have a barrier. Adrinu Rav la'ape. Rav turned away. He didn't want to watch as they were carrying the new makeshift curtain to hang over the wall. Amalo Shmuel. So Shmuel noticed that he didn't want to watch that, and that he wanted to indicate that it was prohibited. So he said, "Ikapid Abba." If Abba, he used to call him Abba. Rashi says elsewhere because he was elder and greater than him in Chachmas, he considered him his superior, even though that they were essentially colleagues. And so he called him Abba. So Ikapid Abba. If Abba is upset about this, Shekule Emaine Bikatrube. We can use his belt to tie it up. We don't have to hang it over the wall. And the Meiri says he was kidding with him and saying, look, there's no reason to be to not watch this. It's permissible to do. Shmuel, Lamaliha. Shmuel, why didn't he need the barrier at all? He says that you can carry even if you didn't hang the barrier. Each one can carry anyhow. So the Gemara says you're right. He didn't put it up because of a halachic reason. He put it up for the privacy. Shmuel of it listen to Yosef Alma. He hung he had them hang this makeshift curtain for privacy. Rav, why didn't he speak up? Why didn't he tell Shmuel? I don't think that's permissible. Rav if he held it was prohibited, he should have said so. The Gemara says yes, that would be on neutral ground or in Rav's city. But Asrei de Shmuel Hava, it was the Naharda, the city of Shmuel, where he was the head of the academy, the Rav, and he wouldn't tell him in his place that it was prohibited. So then why didn't he watch? In this city, he's the Rav, and that would be permissible. He didn't want his own students to say that he follows the opinion of Shmuel. He wanted to indicate that he disagrees for his students, and so he turned away. And that's how we learn that Rav holds that just because it was permissible at the onset of Shabbos does not mean it's permissible for the rest of Shabbos. However, Shmuel is of the opinion that it does remain permissible for the rest of Shabbos, just as Rav Chisda or Rav Chanina taught earlier. The next Mishnah is going to deal with the question of where the fence collapsed, not between 2 courtyards, but it collapsed between a courtyard and a Reshus HaRabim, a Torah level public domain. Does any part of what was previously private property become part of the public domain? And therefore you would not be allowed to carry, and it would be a Torah prohibition if you carry. You had a courtyard that had a fence, and it collapsed to public domain. If anybody carries from the private property to this to this space that the breach happened, and the Gemara at first is going to think it means the entirety of the courtyard, or from private property to it. Either way, it's going to be a Torah prohibition, and they have to bring a sin offering for having transgressed the Torah prohibition of carrying from a private domain to public domain, Rishus Yachid, Rishus Harab. Rabbi Yehuda Eimer, however, Rabbi Yehuda disagrees. Mishum, the Chachamim say, this is Rabbi Eliezer's opinion, and the Chachamim say, that would, even though that it is prohibited to carry because you don't have the fence, it would be a rabbinic prohibition, not a Torah prohibition, because this private property that does not have a wall enclosing it, it is now no longer a private property, a Torah level private property, which requires walls. These walls collapsed. Therefore, it is a carmelis. It is not public domain, but it also is not a private domain. It's a rabbinic public domain, a carmelis, and therefore it is prohibited to carry from there to the public domain, to Rishus HaRabim, and vice versa, but it would not actually be a Torah prohibition, so he doesn't have to bring a chatas offering. Carmelis is like a carmelis. Rabbi Eliezer, so now the Gemara challenges, why did Rabbi Eliezer say that the entire courtyard becomes a public property just because the wall between there, between the public way and the courtyard collapsed? Just because there's a breach and there's no fence between the public way and the courtyard, therefore the courtyard is now a part of the public way. In Rabbi Eliezer Tamei, yes, this is true according to Rabbi Eliezer's other teaching. The Tani we learned, Rabbi Yehuda Eimer Mishum Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Rabbi Eliezer that Rabbim Shabiru Derech La'atzma, even in a private field, if the public way chooses itself a path through the field, Mashabiru Biru, whatever they chose remains their halachic right. This halacha is where there was a public right of way through the property, basically an easement that the public right of way had to go through this field or this property, but it got lost. Got lost either through the winter, it was not passable, and then they didn't know where it was to the east of the property or to the west of the property, and the public right of way chose one avenue within this property in order to take it. It becomes that easement, and Rabbi Eliezer says it becomes the public right of way. And so to here, this courtyard would be talking about where there was originally a path through it, and now they reclaim that. Aini, it's not so. Rav Gidl said in the name of Rav Hufsha Avdul Derech B'Sasada. It has to be that there was originally a path there, an easement that was lost. And if you can tell me that was true even in the courtyard, that the courtyard had a path and then it got lost. That can't be, because actually Rabbi Chanina explained our mission and said the machlokes is in regards to the place up to the place of the wall, but the place of the wall itself is not a machlokes, and it's not just the path, the easement that they're taking, but rather it's seemingly he's saying up to the wall, meaning the entirety of the courtyard is a question of whether or not it's a public way. According to Rabbi Eliezer, it's a Rishus HaRabim public way, and according to the Chachamim, it's not. And if all we're talking about is a portion of the courtyard that was once an easement, once a public right of way, and was lost, and now they're reclaiming it, then it wouldn't be the entire courtyard. So Gemara says you're right. So the first interpretation says that you're right. There's the courtyard itself for sure. Both Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim maintain that the courtyard is still going to be a private property and will not have the halacha of a public right of way. However, the question is where the fence was, right? And we're we typically think of a fence. It's it's a centimeter thick. There their fences were actually, retaining walls, which would have a significant depth to it. And now that the wall collapsed, the question is that the depth of that wall, the space that the wall once stood, is that public right of way or not? And that, Rabbi Eliezer says, is a public right of way, and therefore becomes a Reshus HaRabim, a public domain, and anybody carrying into there is going to have transgressed a Torah prohibition. And the Chachamim is saying, no, that remains the private property without a fence around it. So it's a Carmelis, a rabbinic public way, and there would not be a Torah prohibition for somebody who carried into there. Viba, you say more perhaps, but see there Reshus HaRabim kimifligi. The machlokes in regards to a sidewalk, a side space that's separated from the public, from the proper street, where people can linger and loiter and put their wares out. This is Tzidei Reshus HaRabim. The Gemara at the beginning of Shabbos discusses whether or not that Tzidei Reshus HaRabim require the sides of the public way. They require some sort of barrier, some sort of chifufi, which would be either an elevation or some posts to separate it and to indicate to the travelers on the through traffic travelers that this is a side of the street where people can go slow and window shop, etc. Or it doesn't require that. And here we're going to, our Gemara follows Rav Papa that it does. The Rabbi Eliezer Savat either Reshus HaRabim, Reshus HaRabim Dami. Rabbi Eliezer says that space too counts as a public right of way, even though that traffic is slow and people put the wares out and it's not as easily traveled as the through traffic lane, but nevertheless, it is part of the public right of way, and it is where the people travel through, and so it has the halacha of Reshus HaRabim, of public domain, on the Torah level. V'Rabbanan Savri Tzidei Reshus HaRabim Lav Reshus HaRabim Dami, and the Chachamim they disagree and they say no, the sides of the street don't count as a street, and so therefore where the fence was also doesn't count as a street. So why don't you just argue about sides of the street? Why do you have to talk about where a fence of a private property collapsed? So the Gemara says, because I may have thought the Chachamim disagree with Rabbi Eliezer and say the sides of the street don't count as public property because of these barriers that are there between the proper thoroughfare and the side where people are taking their time, the sidewalk. And since there's the barrier there, that's why the side doesn't count as a part of the public right away. But in a place where you don't actually have these barriers, maybe the Chachamim would agree to Rabbi Eliezer that the sides of the public domain have a halachic status of a Torah level public domain, and carrying into there would be a Torah transgression that requires a karma chatas. Kamash Malan, therefore he said it in this scenario where the wall collapsed, where you don't have a barrier between the public Reshus HaRabim, the public way, and the sides of it, which is where the fence was, and nevertheless the Chachamim say it doesn't have halach of a public way. Now the Gemara challenges and says, how can you say that Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim are talking about where the fence was or the sides of the street and not the courtyard itself? But it said anybody who carries from it, meaning from the courtyard, into a private house, or vice versa, from a private property into the courtyard, it would be a Torah prohibition. But we said that it's from it. So Gemara says, since the Chachamim say that even though you can carry from the house, from a proper enclosed private domain into the courtyard and not transgress on a Torah level, which requires a korban, so they term mitocha entirely where the wall was and the courtyard are all derabanan. So he uses the same language mitocha, but he really means just where the fence was. V'Rabbanan Amar Rabbi Eliezer Tzidei Reshus HaRabim Umahadri Inhu mitocha. Well, then the Chachamim are not responding to Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer is talking about the sides of the street and where the fence was, and and they're responding, oh, if you carry from the courtyard to the house or from the house to the courtyard, you don't transgress. That's not responding to what they were talking about. If you're correct that Rabbi Eliezer was talking about the sides of the street and the wall. So Gemara says you're right. This is Rabbanan and Rabbi Eliezer. The Chachamim are responding to Rabbi Eliezer and say like this: Mila kamoidisla. Don't you agree that the courtyard itself remains a non-Torah level public domain and is private from a Torah level? Don't you agree if you carry from the courtyard to the public domain, to the street proper, or vice versa, that it would not be a Torah transgression because this is not a Rishus HaYachid, it's not a private property, and it's also not a Rishus HaRabim, a Torah property as well. So too, the sides are not going to be the same, are going to be the same. They're not a part of the Rishus HaRabim. Rabbi Eliezer, Hasam like Kadarsi LaRabim, Hacha Kadarsi LaRabim. And Rabbi Eliezer says, well, there's a distinction. In the courtyard, I agree to you because people don't walk into the courtyard because they don't have a right to. But the sides of the street and where the fence was, which are the two versions of what we were talking about, there people actually walk there. That is now a part of the public right of way and the public traveling space, and therefore it does have the halacha of a public Torah level public domain, a Rishus HaRabim.
Is there an argument? I think it's in Shabbos that it depends on like how many people. If there was a big crowd there, they would be pushed inside there.
That's it. You're remembering a scenario. That's a good connection, where somebody made a Karen Zavis. Somebody made a corner. Essentially, somebody pulled their property in from the line of the public right of way. So let's say the street is 16 amos wide, and this is where everybody travels, and everybody on the street, their houses come directly up to the street, and this fella pulled his property in a few feet. So when he built his house, he built it inward. Now, most people are not going to walk in for 2 feet and then walk 10 feet and walk back out. So that doesn't become a part of the public right away. However, when there's a lot of traffic, a lot of people in the street, they would squeeze into there. That's where it would become a part of it. So that is a discussion in Gemara and Shabbos, but not about where the wall collapsed, or rather where they brought their property in and essentially ceded some of the front of their property to the right of way. Mishnah. So the Mishnah says, a courtyard that on two sides, and the Gemara at this point thinks two sides meaning east and west, the walls collapsed and are now there's a breach to the public right away on both sides. It was open to Rishus HaRabim on two sides. Mechin bayis, or a house, shenifretz mishnei ruchasel. Similarly, two sides of the house collapsed, and the Gemara thinks also east-west or north-south, but they're parallel to each other. They collapsed and are now open to public domain. V'chein mavui, similarly, an alleyway which had either a vertical post, a lechi, or a horizontal post, a korah, at the front to make it permissible to carry within there. But the korah, the beams, or the lechi were taken. Rabbi Yehuda says that Shabbos, since at the onset of Shabbos there were proper barriers and you're allowed to carry in there, you're allowed to continue carrying that Shabbos, but it has to be fixed before the future Shabbos, otherwise you can't carry in it. Rabbi Yossi says it, mutar l'esa Shabbos, mutar l'esa love. If they were allowed to carry here today, so then they can carry future because this is a good barrier. And if it's not, if you tell me no, it's not valid for future Shabbos, then also Asur l'esa Shabbos will be prohibited for this Shabbos as well. And so this is Rabbi Yossi's concept of that if it's prohibited future, it's prohibited now, and the Gemara is going to explain this. But for now, we're going to try and understand the scenario of what's the case that these walls collapsed and are open to the public domain. Gemara says, "B'may askina." What are we talking about? Ilema be'eser did the wall collapse and there's a breach more than 10 tefachim, more than 10 amos? I mean, and that counts. That doesn't count as a doorway. That counts as a breach in the wall. A second. If it's 10 up to 10, and therefore it counts as an opening. So who cares whether it's one wall, two walls? One wall, you tell, it is not a problem. Why not? Because it's a doorway. So then on two doors, it should also be a doorway. So you have a doorway on the east and you have a doorway on the west. If up to 10 amos is valid wall with an opening, so that can be true on both sides of the wall. So it must be talking about that the breach was greater than 10, which we've seen throughout the Masechta, that a breach greater than 10 actually eliminates the wall because that's no longer an opening, a doorway. That now becomes an actual breach in the wall. If that's the case, so then even on one side, it should be an invalid courtyard right now because it doesn't have a valid enclosure because it has a breach larger than 10 amos. So Rav says, no, you're right. We're talking about that this wall is breached only up to 10 tefachim. So it really should be a doorway. However, if it's only we're not talking about that it's parallel, but they're perpendicular to each other. The doors are actually right near each other on the corner. So now we're on 94b, Tzadi Dalet Amud Beis, and the opening is on a corner, meaning that the breach was up to 10 amos on the southwest corner of this courtyard, and on the south side, and on the west side. So then there's 10 amos on each side, but now you actually have a complete opening. That entire corner is missing. And people don't make a doorway on a corner, and therefore it doesn't count as a valid doorway. The pischa, bekaren zavis le'avdi inchi, people don't make a doorway like that. And since it doesn't count as a proper doorway, you cannot count it on a corner. You cannot count it as a doorway. It counts as a breach larger than 10 amos, and it therefore is open to the public reshus harabim, the public way, and you cannot maintain it as an enclosed area.